Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. Gonna do a podcast today with Dusty Cubes, aka the Woke Centrist, aka CRT Centrist, aka Dustin Cubit, my frequent conversation partner, and we're gonna talk about critical race theory, of course, which is all the rage in the public discourse today. And as usual, Dusty and I share the opinion that public intellectuals like James Lindsay and Dave Rubin and the usual suspects like Jordan Peterson and members of the IDW and a bunch of right wingers are demonizing and taking down strawmans about critical race theory. And as Dusty usually likes to do, he likes to read up on a subject when it's popular in the discourse. So he read a textbook about critical race theory, and I read it as well. And we're going to do one thing that I like to do a lot on this channel, which is basically take down a lot of public intellectuals' complete mischaracterizations of academic movements and explain what they're getting wrong and why it's a problem to demonize controversial and interesting philosophers. And I'm sure we both have a lot of thoughts about it. And Dusty usually doesn't have his camera on, but and we're gonna do another chat about this with Peter Salmon, the author of a Derrida biography, of course, about this, but just Dusty and I today. And of course, I wanted to include Dusty because I think his thoughts are always interesting on these subjects. And also, he is, of course, of the noble black race. So, according to the woke people, his opinions are more valid than mine on this subject. So to start off with, want to just say like your kind of like what led to you reading that textbook and kind of what you thought was surprising about it and kind of just your general thoughts about the way it's being portrayed in public discourse right now.
Right. So the textbook we're referring to is called An Introduction to Critical Race Theory, and it was written by Delgado. What's his first name? Is it Richard or Robert? Well, anyway, Delgado and Stefankis, who are both primarily known as critical race scholars that teach at law school. So, what is this CRT that people keep talking about? So, the reason why I dove into CRT specifically is because there's been a number of different news reports about schools introducing CRT into the curriculum. And a number of these news reports are actually local to my area. So if you take a look at CRT in schools, just do like a Google search and they'll talk about DC area schools. So those are the schools around me. So I don't live right in DC, but I'm in the DC metro area. I'm in the suburb of it. So I've been watching like all these local news reports of school board meetings and how people are basically coming to blows at school board meetings. And you have these like really angry parents with their signs and saying, oh, people are going to be taught to hate America and that white people are all evil and yada, yada, yada. I was like, this can't be true. This just sounds so ridiculous. So I went and tried to research a bit about what these parents were angry about. And if it turns out that the CRT thing is mostly a right-wing scare, but what's really interesting is that the right's definition of CRT was actually embraced by a teachers union, and then there's like a big scare about a teachers union wanting to include that in their curriculum. And then what people don't understand is like the bureaucracy that is behind the machinery that distributes the curriculum to public schools. So it's not simply, oh, the teachers union, they all want to teach CRT. It's like, okay, but guess what? The teachers union is an advocacy group. They don't create policy. And basically all the local schools create the policy at the local level. So,
Okay.
people are afraid, oh, they're going to teach CRT all over the country and blah, 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 blah. And it's blatantly not true. And I like to differentiate the two CRTs, is what I like to call it. I call it academic CRT, which is focused on teaching civil rights lawyers about racial discrimination. And then the kitchen sink version that the right likes to focus on, and that would be everything else, including like wacky stuff like Robin DiAngelo and Ta-Nehisi Coates and what have you. Even though like Ta-Nehisi Coates himself is not a CRT scholar, however,
Either is Robin DiAngelo or any of those popularizers of what people call critical race theory, even though they themselves don't even use that term in their books.
well, I would say that Robin DiAngelo was a professor in whiteness studies, which is a more fringe offshoot of CRT. It's not really. It's like one of the subgenres, I guess, if you want to call it, because if like there's the academic CRT I like to refer to, which is like the version of it that's taught to law students, and then there's the everything else kitchen sink CRT, which is all the other wacky opinions you tend to hear from people saying like, well, because some of the things that they say that people say are clearly straw men. Like I've never heard anybody of any level of credibility say that white people invented slavery.
Yeah,
Like
that's clearly not true. And
yeah,
or like, and you don't see anything in that book about claims like that all white people are always racist in every interaction, and we should all hate white people, and America is a racist country based on slavery, and teachers should teach children to hate white people.
yeah. So one thing, because I think there's just a general misunderstanding of how racism is referred to in CRT, and it's a more clinical description of racism as opposed to ethical or moral kind of description. Because anyone that's called a racist outside of these circles, that's like one of the worst socially damning thing you could call somebody, right? A racist.
Yeah. Well, and also like as you've mentioned before, I think two interesting things to discuss are like within the different academic within the academic CRT, there are different types of that too. Like I'm more interested in the like what is as you alluded to the more dominant the far more dominant type of it, which is just like as it started off as legal theory like that, and it did branch off into other things, but there are different types of academic approaches, like there are race abolitionists who focus on exploring race as a social construct, and of course people like uber right wingers and uber left wingers, as usual, get this term social construct wrong all the time, like assuming that the term social construct implies that race has absolutely nothing to do with biology, and they talk about this with gender too. But even, as I like to often mention, even the right or libertarian leaning Thomas Sowell says in his book called Intellectuals and Race that race is a social construct based on biological characteristics. So social construct is just a concept that society decides is valid based on agreement about it, and this concept is constructed of biological characteristics. And then, like you said, there are like CRT people who are like they're like all they do, and they're the most annoying type to me, and they probably are to you too, who they're the fringe annoying group who spend all their time focusing on, okay, in this hypothetical situation, which particular part of this situation is the worst form of oppression for this hypothetical black transgender woman in this situation. So my point is that there are different types of academic critical race theory, and the dominant ones still have nothing to do with this crazy like Robin DiAngelo white fragility shit, and or like whiteness studies or anything like that. And social construct has a very specific meaning that both like uber purple-haired SJWs and crazy right-wingers get wrong all the time.
All right. So, one of the things that just looking into CRT is that there's, even within the scholars, like the academic version,
Dustin,
there's
here's your reminder.
like, hold
check
on.
plants.
Was that your reminder for checking plants?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's Alexa going off. Sorry about
Dustin, here is your reminder. Check plants.
Okay.
All right. So, yeah, what I was saying is even within the academic versions of CRT, the law school versions of CRT that, we brought up, there is differing opinion. There is dissent. They don't all agree with each other. It's not a kind of a monolithic view. But CRT, I think one of the reasons why the right is so afraid of it is because they basically don't understand what it is. And, when you don't understand something, you're going to fear it. And that's basically what we have going on. So the fear is, if you teach your kids these things, you're teaching your kids to hate America, hate white people, become communists, all the other Marxists and socialists and whatnot. I know there's 5 tenets to CRT. Some of them I'm like, that's kind of weird. Did you want to talk about some of those tenets? Oh, you're muted there.
Sorry, I forgot I had myself muted there. Yeah, I'm not sure if I wrote those down or made a note of those. I can check here though. Did you?
Well,
I don't
remember. We can briefly talk about some of them. Like there's this tenet of storytelling. So, and this is a really interesting one, and it definitely applies to courtrooms and arguing cases, especially when you're trying to win an argument. So one of the things that they've said is that when it comes to telling stories of truth, so to speak, it's not always good to argue the facts of the matter. And this is a really interesting concept because think about how powerful stories are.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the
science. Science is a story,
right? So just think of some of the stories that people follow that ultimately leads to, violent action. So we're talking about like January the 6th. These people were told the story that Donald Trump lost an election through election fraud. Like regardless of whether there are facts supporting that, the story was powerful enough to foster this, riot at the Capitol.
right?
And we're talking about things like flat earthers. Look at the story of the flat Earth and how many people bought into that. The story of ivermectin, or the story of microchips in the COVID vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
So telling these stories in a very compelling way is sometimes, and a lot of times I'll say, more powerful than actually presenting the facts and the evidence. Like imagine because you watched that COVID kind of Q&A with Dr. Rhonda Patrick and some other doctor, right?
I like that. That was very detailed.
So just think of that. It's extremely heavy. It has a lot of facts. There's a lot of technical detail and scientific detail that they go through. So imagine just handing that to a layman and asking them to digest that versus someone who creates a dramatized version of conspiracy and big pharma is acting against you. And because the fact is that one story riles your emotions while one story just tells you the facts and details. And I believe because one of those stories targets emotions, it becomes more powerful, and it has a more powerful narrative when you just give it to the random, average Joe, so to speak. So that's one of the tenets of CRT, that they say that storytelling can be more powerful than simply presenting facts and things of that nature.
Yeah, certainly. And as you're saying, that can be used in a good way or a bad way. And like a lot of people who don't really know what they're talking about when it comes to critical race theory are telling a story and interpreting critical race theory in a bad way, even though they're actually mistaken and get it incorrect. Whereas people can also basically the examples you used are people using telling stories in a bad way too. But you can also tell good stories, which seems like the original point of creating these types of arguments and creating new stories in legal theory, like basically focusing on how laws have disproportionately affected Black people that are like leftovers from the Jim Crow era, and focus on these subjects for this part of the story.
Right. So another tenet I wanted to focus on, and this is a really interesting tenet. One of the tenets of CRT is that racism is not aberrational, it's normal, it's ordinary. And I thought this was really interesting, and it kind of removes like the narrow, it actually really broadens the category of racism. Most people would think that, okay, racism is only present when someone is able to prove that the intent is due to racial superiority or something of that nature. Like for instance, if we're talking about jury selection, people will use race to change the makeup of a jury, because say your defendant, and this could work either way here. Say your defendant is Black, so it doesn't matter what the makeup is of the lawyer themselves, they're going to try in jury selection to get as many Black people in that jury as possible. Right? And then the prosecution is going to do the opposite.
Yeah, of course.
But yes, it's illegal to remove or change jurors because of their race, but you can basically use any other reason to mark them off of a jury. So knowing the information that, okay, if we have more Black people on the jury, it's going to go in this Black defendant's favor. That's racism.
Yeah.
Like, it's using race as a leverage tool. The same thing in the opposite direction. It's just unfortunate that it's a basic part of human psychology. For me, I just consider racism a subset of tribalism. It's You're never going to defeat it totally, which is something else they talk about in CRT. So when
And
they say,
yeah,
go ahead.
or just to, sorry, just to comment on that that definition of race, that definition of racism too. I think the broadening of the definition is, like, to me, one of the problems in this whole discussion, because it's it kind of reminds me of when I learned this about so-called postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida. Like, when I actually started reading books about them, I very quickly learned that their theories are descriptive. They're not prescriptive, and that's another thing that that people don't understand about this, that I think can be a problem, because like these slogans like defund the police or Black Lives Matter or something like that, people using them don't understand, or if we're talking about like the uber lefty crowd, maybe even don't look into what the definitions actually mean too, and then there are disagreements about the definition. So like right wingers go with the least charitable definition of it. But the like I said, though, the important thing to understand is that this broadening of the definition of racism, it's much more descriptive than prescriptive. It's like talking about basically kind of like sociologically the presence of racism in society in terms of judgments that people make about Black people or people of other races that are not white, that are not necessarily even judgments born of malice. They're like judgments that are kind of a side effect of structures that are systemically oppressing Black people and people of other races that aren't white, without necessarily, like I said, having any malicious intent.
Right. So yeah, the racism broadening, it is like, I get it, because to me, racism is a spectrum. It's not the switch that you turn on and off, and you turn on the switch and someone suddenly is a racist. You turn the switch off and somebody isn't. It's just kind of a fluid thing in our society. Like, there are definitely, like, for instance, there are definitely people who prefer dating a specific race,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I think most
That is
people
racial
prefer dating people in their own races, like regardless of what race we're talking about.
Yeah, some people do. Like, that's not actually true for everybody.
Of course. Yeah, of course.
But
Like, I kind of have a thing for Latina women.
yeah, so I've mostly dated like Latinas, like, previously. So that's basically it. Like, it's been mostly Latinas that I've dated. I'm with a Black Latina. That's an interesting thing. But
Okay.
right now, so yeah, the racism as a broad concept, I think what people get hung up about it is they keep thinking about the moral and ethical aspects of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, when talking about racism as a broader concept, it's like, what words do you use to describe that broader concept other than racism? It's sometimes we got to think of hey, some of these actual definitions and the names are poorly chosen. It could be simply that, like,
Yeah, for sure.
like whiteness. From what I understand, it is that whiteness isn't actually a description of a a physical characteristic.
Yeah, it's more
What's
like sociological kind of, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just because I think it's not arguable that primarily white people in the United States hold more power than everybody else.
Yeah, generally.
And they have some cultural dominance when it comes to culture itself.
Right.
And when you think of white culture versus black culture, there are things in black culture that are considered morally wrong, right? And that's because whoever has the power in the society deems what is morally right and morally wrong.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is why most, I guess, outside of like straight up slavery and racism and stuff like that, it's why when it comes to whites, and I'm just thinking this is more of like a concept, because when you come to cultural assimilation, they're talking about the dominant culture in the United States, and they label that culture as white, even though
Right.
a black person could be well within this so-called white structure, or an Asian person can be in this so-called structure. It's just, unfortunately, they call it whiteness instead of something like
Yeah.
the dominant cultural, the current dominant cultural hegemony would be like a more accurate description than
Yeah.
whiteness. Because
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
because if black people all of a sudden became like the dominant cultural hegemony, like, are they going to have to change the definition to blackness? And
Yeah,
what?
yeah, that's really interesting. That's one thing I was thinking about too. Um, related to that point that you just made, which, like I said, I think is really good, because like if like black people or Latina people are like they're still participating in the dominant culture, then people can say that black people or Latino people or Asian people are exhibiting whiteness. And then if you say a phrase like that, then a lot of people are automatically going to assume that when you say this person is exhibiting whiteness, that you're making a moral judgment about them. And a lot of people actually are making moral judgments about them. But when people are using critical race theory in the academic sense, that's again more of a sociological description than a moral judgment. And I was thinking about this too. It's kind of like related to what Thaddeus Russell talks about in Renegade History of the United States, which you and I talked about before. He talks about, for example, how the first Irish and Jewish and like Scottish immigrants and any other type of white people that weren't like British or European or something like that, they were literally referred to by the N-word and considered black when they first came to America, and then they were absorbed into the white race eventually. So like I wonder how much that trend is going to increase, because like Asian people, for example, they're not white, but they're kind of like culturally seen as closer to white than Latina or black people, even in like the sociological sense. Like people don't focus on the oppression of Asian people as much. And I wonder if like Asian people are going to eventually be considered white, and maybe Latina people, and maybe black people, or if it'll go completely different directions. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, and it's these concepts and these lenses to view things aren't the only lens to view things. This is just something to just take a look at and consider. It's the same when you're going through different and looking at different philosophies and different ideological concerns. Of course, some of these groups are going to have things that you can take and make your own and adopt into your own worldview. Like, I don't completely dismiss every right-wing idea that I hear, and I don't completely dismiss every left-wing idea that I hear. I try to look at stuff that sounds true to me, and then, try to adopt that. Like when I'm thinking of the right, like, I think they do have a valid point about, when they talk about race, well, I'll say the right, the middle, and the moderate left. I'm pretty much just excluding the far right and far left here. Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of the main thought about how to deal with racial issues is basically to kind of not address them or try to act in a way that they don't exist. The problem with that is that when these things do occur, like, how do you address them? Like, you can't simply say, all we need to do is act like they don't exist, or, I don't see color. And that's a good ideal to have. Ultimately, it would be great if it was not a factor. And the problem is just, I think this is a unique problem to the United States. I don't know how much of an issue this is in other countries, but one thing
it's an issue. It's an issue in Canada too.
Yeah, so
maybe less of one.
Maybe less of one, but you can't just not talk about race and it will disappear one day. You're going to have to critically address grievances and issues. Usually the analogy I like to make is, because, I don't see colorblindness. Well, what if you approached homelessness that way and you said, oh, I don't see homelessness. So how does that fix homelessness? It's there. Yeah. You can't simply just say it doesn't exist or say nothing is currently wrong with it, so let's not really bring it up. I think that is one of the other main critiques that critical race theory makes, is that when you go this avenue, you tend to actually ignore the grievances that are happening. I understand that ultimately you want to attain a state where race isn't a thing that's mentionable, or even, you want to, there's one thing to act like there is racial equality by saying you don't see color, but that just kind of just denies the realities of what's happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, like that's why, like, I personally am really sympathetic towards, like, race abolitionist arguments, because even, like, from a post-structuralist perspective, it's like, I really think that the concept of race and other concepts like gender mostly just serve to divide people and point out how people are different from each other rather than how we're similar. But the reason I am not a race or gender abolitionist is, like you were saying, the way that these concepts work in society. Like, the way we operate in society, race and gender are not really useful concepts, but we can't just pretend that they don't exist, because they do exist, because we can't not notice the color of someone's skin or what appears to be their gender. And, like, if we, like, the concept of race is useful, as you were saying, in trying to figure out how to solve the problems of like systemic oppression that some people go through, and it's not like, that's not to say that, like, more black people being in prison for drug crimes than white people, for example, is only caused by racism. I think it's all
Right.
these
There's
situations are
many
always
factors.
yeah, it's always somewhat due to race, class, and culture in varying degrees, depending on the situation. And like similar to gender, for example, it could be good to go to assume that people to not really address genders, but people interact with men and women interact with each other in that way based on their gender.
Right.
And especially when it comes to sex, you're not going to be you could be like, well, I don't really care whether you have a dick or a vagina. Yeah, a lot of people are bisexual, but most people are not. Most people are heterosexual. So it is like these are important concepts to consider, race and gender.
Yeah, one of the big problems with discussion about it is that the arguments often come to a false dichotomy, and I see this. And the false dichotomy is it's all race or no race is involved in that decision. A lot of that has to stem from, police shootings or court decisions and tendencies that happen with court. So they're like, oh, it's probably this other factor here. It has nothing to do with race. But it's like a false dichotomy. There's going to be some racial element to it. It might be a huge element or a small element, but you can't completely erase that element from the list of ingredients there. It's just going to be there. And one of the things I often use to kind of prove that point is usually, and this is where I can get some people on the right to agree with me. And first I asked them, well, when it comes to sentencing, do you think that women get lesser sentences than men? And 99% of the time I hear them agree with that. Yes, women do get less sentences for the same crimes. So, and then I asked them, and it's because they're men and women, it's because they're different genders, right? And that happens to women. It's like a double standard. So then I asked them, well, why wouldn't that be the same with race? Like race could also be a factor why there could be some disparity there. It doesn't have to be the only factor. It could be a number of different factors. Because I'm pretty sure that like a wealthy woman going into the court is going to have an easier time than a poor woman. So there's multiple factors there, as opposed to like a wealthy man versus a poor man. There's different percentages of factors that will either negatively affect them in court or positively affect them in court.
Yeah.
So usually when I talk to these people, say, hey, this is not a dichotomy. It's not. Racism is not a part of it, or it's all racism. That's not how it works. That's not how society isn't that simple. Like human interaction isn't that simple, and decision making isn't that simple. Like when we make decisions about our lives, we don't make it based off of one single factor most of the time.
Yeah, of course.
Like even people who say they vote for a single issue and they're voting based on that. I often think that I know I've said that myself, but they're just kind of saying that because they're not admitting to other things that they might like about that candidate.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, like we just had a Canadian federal election, and I was looking at different interviews with the candidates and their policies, and as usually happens when it comes to an election, I had a little bit of trouble deciding between two or three different candidates, and the one that I voted for was the Green Party, because I saw an interview with the leader, and she had some interesting policies like focusing on the climate, but also she was not for vaccine mandates, which is a stereotype of what left-wing people are for, because she was talking about how like indigenous people who have in our country in particular, who have a series of a history of being oppressed by white people, don't trust the government and medical institutions as much, anywhere near as much as white people on average. So she wants to educate people about the science of vaccines rather than mandating that everyone get them, to address the root of the problem rather than putting a band-aid on it, which I thought was really good. And she also refused to attack other candidates too, even though the host was like prodding her and trying to get her to do that.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the word oppression is that it's a completely subjective word.
Certainly, yeah, for sure.
So when someone says oppression, like I know oppression's kind of like a hot button word that triggers like deeply conservative people. I know a lot of it is because it has roots. Well, I wouldn't say roots, but there are certain ideologies that kind of overemphasize oppression. I think Marxism is one, but what oppression is, it's the undue use of power, the undue leverage of power against another group. And who gets to decide what is due and what is undue. It's a completely subjective definition there. So a lot of times when people have arguments over, these people say that they're oppressed, it's basically, it's a matter of opinion. It's not a fact, but the matter of opinion is defined by the society at large and how they view that. In some societies, like for instance, largely very, I would say, some moderate rights, moderate lefts would say that Islamic countries oppress their women by forcing them to wear, et cetera, et cetera. And in their countries that have a different social framework, to them it's not oppression at all. And even to the women, it's not oppression at all. It's like a mark of being a devout in their own religion. Yeah.
And also, like, one important point to make, I think, is that like I would say that we're certainly not saying, and most people don't say, that if someone is experiencing oppression, we should just totally ignore personal responsibility and, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. People, like, personal responsibility is important for people, but people also experience oppression. It's not a dichotomy. It's not like you have to choose one or the other. Like, these things are going to vary in degrees as all the other factors that we're talking about.
Right. All this stuff is interwoven. And the problem with a lot of the dialogue is that we're always mostly dealing with false dichotomies, basically. Like when we're arguing about this stuff, it's online or with whoever, it's like, okay, it's either one or the other, or there's no spectrum in between A and B. It's just, you're either this or you're that. You're with me or you're against me. Yeah. And it's almost like you have to go and talk about that spectrum before you even talk about the issue at hand and agree. Because when you're going into these false dichotomy arguments, it almost becomes futile. It's just completely futile to deal with unless you can establish that, these things are very malleable. They're not concrete. They can change. Like one person could be maybe 1% gay and another person's like half gay and another's like 75% gay. Or, if we're just thinking about gender, someone might feel more female than male. Someone might be like super male. And
these sorts of concepts, exploring them in this way is like influenced my own life personally too. like as you said, like sexuality is not on a spectrum, and like reading about Foucault and learning about post-structuralists actually convinced me to experiment with my own sexuality more, and I discovered that I'm not bisexual and I'm not gay, because I certainly am like way more attracted to women than men. Like I don't even consider my like I don't even think about men sexually, but I've experimented sexually with a few trans people, and that seems to work for me. But I'm like comfortable with certain sexual things but not other sexual things, and I'm comfortable with way more sexual things with women than with trans people, and I'm not actually attracted to men. So like I discovered, as is probably the case with most people, that my sexuality is complex, and it's not like I'm 100% straight, or you're like either 100% straight or 100% gay or 100% bisexual. There's probably at least a tiny bit of variation for most people. Like I've heard a few comedians make jokes about how, you know, some guys say they're totally straight, but then they go, whenever they look at porn, they always look up chick smashed by huge black cock.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because we're talking about how we're just trying to avoid, usually when I talk about things, I kind of try to avoid the dichotomy of things.
Mhm.
Like, you're either racist or not. I don't believe in that. There's just some spectrum of racism that occurs in everybody. You're like, are you
Mhm.
gay or not? Maybe I might be 1% gay, which is like almost nothing. Yeah. So, um, yeah, so when it comes to CRT, I was kind of looking up just kind of the controversy around, and it's mostly people fearing indoctrination, right?
Mhm.
So, one of the things I was looking up is, how is the Civil War taught in America? And basically, you can almost break it down into 50% in half. So in one way, it's taught that the Civil War was fought over slavery. And then half of the time, and we're talking about K through 12, half of the time it's taught that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. So you have two completely different versions within our own country on how the Civil War is fought. And I think that's really interesting, that we have two versions taught in schools. So
yeah, and that's not a dichotomy either, right?
no, there's probably both are involved. States' rights plus slavery. It's probably both. Like
From what
I don't
I
think wars
understand,
are completely fought over one reason. Like if you think of
yeah,
American Iraq, there's incentives there. So yeah, you
for
want to
sure.
stop these people from doing bad stuff, but look at all these resources that Iraq has that we can utilize. Look how much global influence we can have if we're a player in this area. It's not just, oh, bad guys did one bad thing to us, let's go get them and take over the country. It's
Yeah,
just not how shit works.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's like one of the things that I think we were talking about this before before we started the stream, was that video that you and I both watched with that philosopher and that journalist who you said reported on Gamergate, and they were talking about James Lindsay and like how he's gone like way off the deep end with this critical race theory stuff, like more so than I even realized. And we were talking before the stream about how he became a Trump supporter and voted for Trump and became super authoritarian, even though he's always talking about the importance of free speech, because Trump said that he was going to ban the teaching of critical race theory in schools, which, if I understand correctly, that law that was drafted has a really fucking ambiguous terminology to it too. So critical race theory could mean a lot of different things. And the important aspect of that is that it's a super authoritarian thing to do, as you pointed out to me a long time ago.
Yeah, basically it's a speech ban, which is crazy that we would have anything like that going on, saying, "Oh, you can't say this and that to our kids." Like I understand that, yeah, you're not going to teach kids indecent things, um, as a rule, but hey, you can't say this. And when I was looking at the list of things, and they call it the 1776 Commission. That was the commission that Trump formed to
Is that like the
combat
opposition? Is that the opposition to the
1619 project.
that yeah.
So it was the opposition to that project, as well as like kind of a general kitchen sink, um, like a kitchen sink opposition to CRT. So
Right.
I took a look at some of the stuff, and it's so vague, that it's like unenforceable. It just didn't make any sense. But it's like, oh, you can't teach your kids to hate America. It's like, what does that mean? What does that
Yeah.
mean? You know,
I bet,
like,
like it seems like obviously no one is doing that explicitly. I wonder if, well, I bet like some of the people who are saying that probably mean that like this idea they have in their heads that white people created a racist country in America and everything is racist. That's what they mean maybe by like teaching your children to hate America and hate white people or something like that.
yeah, that's the component where there's kind of a disconnect, where CRT kind of uses racism as, it's removed from morality and ethics, whereas when you talk about racism to any person, especially, well, being called a racist as a white person is probably, I would say, more damaging. To call a white person a racist than a black person a racist, it's just, there's
Yeah.
more social stigma, calling a white person that.
Yeah, for
Because
sure.
I think they would be more cancelable, per se.
Mm-hmm. That's like that
So
reminds me of one thing we were talking about. Like we've talked about Daryl Davis before, of course, that black musician who has converted many white supremacists and Nazis by befriending them. That's the one aspect of that I've thought about. Like for me personally, if I went to a KKK rally or something like that, no one would fucking believe that I'm trying to infiltrate them and befriend them in order to convert them. Everyone would just assume I'm actually a white supremacist just lying about that shit.
yeah, that would be a hard sell. That'd be a
Yeah.
hard sell there. But yeah, CRT. I think it's just, the problem is just people don't approach stuff with nuance. They automatically get defensive and tribal. Like, I understand why people would get defensive and tribal. Like when I'm reading into it, I can understand how, okay, if somebody who is white and they're kind of not familiar with this stuff, and they're just kind of diving into it, and they hear all this stuff about whiteness and oppression and blah 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 blah, they start to get defensive about it, especially if they're thinking about it about a moral or ethical, in a moral or ethical way, which is like why I don't agree with some versions, like some, I guess I would call it the fringe offshoot, kind of like the D'Angelo stuff, which actively tries to make white people guilty about things. I was like, why do that?
Yeah.
It's not helpful at
And then
all.
do the what is it, like unconscious bias training, which has like been proved scientifically to not work.
Well, I don't even know what the purpose of unconscious bias training is. I think it's okay to be aware that you might be biased in your decision making, but
Yeah.
I don't, like, what is the training actually supposed to do? Is it just supposed to? Is it supposed to make you aware of it, or is it supposed to actually make you change? Like the only way you can change unconscious bias is to change your environment. You can't.
I think that like all it seems to me to do is to serve to make white people feel guilty all the time.
Well, yeah, I don't get it, to be honest. I don't know what it's supposed to accomplish, because the only way you can affect the unconscious bias is to actually affect like society itself. Like you telling somebody that they have unconscious biases ain't gonna fix them from having unconscious bias. It's not gonna do much. So
of course.
But one of the things I do think is important though is to understand that people have different viewpoints and views and experiences, and that they might not see things the same as you do, regardless of what race or gender or whatever they are.
Yeah, so, of course.
That's and I've seen and been in diversity trainings. And what diversity trainings? Yeah, because I got to take them for my job.
Oh, okay.
So basically, they tell you.
That's funny because you're. It's funny because you're black. Why would they do? Wouldn't they do? Why wouldn't they just do that with only white people if they're going to do that?
Well, because it concerns everybody. Because
I guess so.
Like in critical race theory, they also teach you about white stereotypes.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
That's true. So if we're talking about like actual critical race theory and not the Robin DiAngelo type of shit.
No, because the diversity training I went to or did wasn't Robin DiAngelo white guilt diversity training.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize there were different ways of doing that. Okay.
No, like the one I took, it's like, okay, people have different cultures, they have different viewpoints, and try to respect those things as much as possible. Like it wasn't all about.
That seems pretty straightforward and common sense. Basically, that's a good idea to remind people of.
Yeah, and it was very basic. It's like it had nothing to do with attacking white people specifically. Like
right.
The only thing is we went together, we talked about, they told us to choose 3 identities. So you could choose whatever you want. And I chose father, African American, and I forgot the other. And each of these different identities have certain viewpoints. Like, hey, as a father, I have certain viewpoints. As an African American, I have certain viewpoints. And you just talk about how those could be different and how to respect those certain viewpoints. Of course, nobody in the training said use the white. I thought it would be interesting if someone did. Like I wouldn't have been against it or anything, but nobody chose that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and nobody chooses if they are straight. Nobody chooses I'm straight, right?
That makes sense because those are like the common way
normalized.
That people are.
Yeah, they're kind of normal.
Yeah, normalized.
Identities.
Yeah.
So yeah, we would just talk. Even though father is not, I would consider normalized, but
yeah,
I don't know. So we got to choose those identities and talk about them. That's all what the diversity training was. Had zero to do with attacking white people. It was basically just, hey, people have different viewpoints and different experiences, and you have to respect those. Someone might have a religious thing that you think is kind of odd, but hey, you got to respect it. You know what I mean? You can't just be an asshole because they have some weird ass religion view of religion.
Yeah, especially since that's like it really has little to no effect on anyone else the vast majority of the time. If it's infringing on other people's liberty to an extent, then we could have a discussion about that. But the vast majority of the time, it's not going to affect anyone.
Yeah, and a lot of the times, the people who have extremely fringe views tend to isolate themselves quite a bit, and at least try to isolate those views. So even then, in a group where we're talking about if there was a white supremacist there, I pretty much have 100% certainty they wouldn't bring it up. So yeah, diversity training, I guess, can vary on its quality and what it's trying to accomplish, but I've never seen in my life any diversity training that actually like attacks white people. Like I had a transgender specific diversity training, and it was basically just how do you talk to transgender people, and like one of the things that they basically told us to not offend, and I kind of agree. Like when you talk to somebody, you just refer to their name, because you can never assume that the voice that you hear over a phone is attributed to a male or a female.
Yeah, right? That's true.
And sometimes you might have some really high-pitched male dudes that would be really offended being called ma'am, and then you might have like some manly-sounding women that are actually like biological women that would get upset if you called them a man. It's just kind of common sense stuff, but also probably, applies to transgender people, because hey, you might either get a biological man or male that has an abnormal voice, or you might have a transgender person who's doesn't have kind of the voice that matches their gender. So they basically said in order to not offend those types of people, just don't use genderized language when you're talking to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like you said, it sounds kind of common sense, at least in retrospect too. Like that's basically what I do. I just like call people by their names, and like in terms of this gender pronoun thing too. Like I'll call people whatever the fuck they want me to call them. Like I could call you Xena Warrior Princess, or refer to you as an attack helicopter. I don't fucking care. But
yeah, I don't give a crap. Like I don't understand why some people care so much. They're a girl, I'm gonna call them a girl. It's a boy, I'm gonna call them a boy. It's like, okay. Okay, guy. It's like, I think you're a woman. I'm gonna call you a woman then.
Yeah.
And it's like some buff ass dude.
This reminds me of too. Remember that Ben Shapiro and Neil deGrasse Tyson exchange about transgender people? And he was trying to get Tyson to agree with him about the transgender stuff, and he said, "Yes, but these people are getting the biology wrong. Isn't that really fucking important as a scientist to you?" And Tyson had basically reacted like, "Why do you care, man? Like, it doesn't affect you. Maybe we should explore these subjects, whether it's scientifically or sociologically, who knows? But why do you have a problem with it?"
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of based off of a straw man. It's like, oh, these people, they're not following science. I think and what Shapiro was trying to say is that, oh, these people are saying things that are contrary to science.
And also, like you said, like he's bringing down, like he's addressing straw men. Like go and actually talk to transgender people. I mean, small sample size, of course, but
unfortunately, he has. I've seen many times where he's talked to them on panels, and he always refers to them as their biological gender. Which is pretty messed up.
I mean, like any transgender person I talk to, they don't literally think that they actually are biologically the sex that they want to be. That's delusion. That's delusion. That's not being transgender. Like a transgender person is by definition presenting and wanting to be the opposite of your biological gender. It's not like I think we talked about this maybe recently. Like it's not like they'll like take their pants off and say, no, this dick is a vagina, or no, this vagina is a dick. Like,
yeah,
what?
exactly.
No.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I'll send you an audiobook. It's actually Brett and Heather Hines' new book, and they actually get into gender a bit, and they're like, yeah, gender is a social construct. So they are definitely kind of some people criticize them about some of the wacky stuff that they say, but when it comes to gender and stuff, they're actually pretty accurate in saying that it's a spectrum, and gender expression is different from sex. And there's definitely, like, even animals have different gender expressions. And they talk about how there are certain animals that can express as different gender. So it's not something that's foreign. It's not a foreign concept to people who are evolutionary biologists. It's like they understand that point. But
okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, like you said, we've talked before about how like Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang, they're both kind of they're basically spreading misinformation about the utility of ivermectin and the supposed threat of vaccines, but their specialty is biology. And when they're talking about subjects like what you described, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, the book isn't like social war bullshit, which I was afraid it was going to be. It's not. It's basically evolutionary biology, and they have an interesting perspective. And I'll send you that audiobook when I get the chance. Sweet. I just got it recently.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to read that.
All right. So I guess we're probably going to have to wrap it up a bit, because I will have to go out now and grab dinner for the folks. And hopefully we can get together with Peter at a later time if possible. And I'm going to go dive into CRT more a bit too.
That's a good idea, actually. Yeah, and if you see any audiobooks, please send those my way too, because I would like to educate myself a little bit more too. And actually, I just saw on Twitter while we were talking to Peter Salmon assumed that something came up and he only had an hour, but he will talk with us about this subject too. I suggested like next week or the week after that.
Okay, just let me know. That way I can properly prepare myself. I know today I was like, shit, I gotta go grocery shopping. Let me run out there real quick and see if we can get back home. But it seemed to work out okay.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is.
If you want to do it earlier next time, that's fine too. Okay. But yeah, just let me know.
Yeah, for sure, man. All right. Well, yeah. So as usual, thanks for talking with me, man. This was a fun and interesting discussion, and hopefully we helped correct some misconceptions about critical race theory, and explain a little bit about why it's a problem to spread misinformation about it. And like just to sum up that part a little bit, I think that it's a problem to spread misinformation about these ideas, because just like as I learned with post-structuralists like Foucault or Derrida / postmodernism, and then more recently as I've been reading more about critical theory, there are valid criticisms of these things, but they actually have a lot of really interesting ideas that can really make you think and are really important, and they deserve a lot more merit than they often get. So that's why it's important to, as you've said many times before, investigate the boogeyman when it comes to what seems like dangerous ideas, because I fully believe that there's no such thing as a dangerous idea. What's important is the way people implement these ideas. You can even have a violent idea, but if you don't act on that idea, then to me it's not a dangerous idea.
I'm not sure I'll fully agree with it, because people are stupid.
Yeah, it's true.
So, and that is, what is that? Wizard's rule number 2 or Wizard's rule 1? People are
Oh,
stupid.
yeah. Yeah, I think so. Something like that.
Um, yeah, but that's something that could be explored at another time. One thing I will
Yeah,
say
for
too
sure.
is, like, I definitely have criticisms of CRT. I have
Oh, yeah, me
criticisms of
too.
the more fringe versions. Like, if you want to consider D'Angelo and her ilk part of the CRT, I definitely have criticisms with that. Like, I gave her book
Oh,
one
yeah.
star, I think. It was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
horrible crap.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we talked about that on your channel. So if people are interested, they should check out that discussion on your channel, Woke Centrist, where we basically deconstructed and intellectually shat all over white fragility. So we're not like pro like Robin DiAngelo uber lefties just defending every aspect of this shit. It's important for people to remember that. I'm not sure if I would consider that critical race theory, but whether you consider it that or not, I agree that that kind of shit is totally dumb. And even like some of the original people, like I think on that podcast we mentioned, that philosopher was talking about how Kimberly Crenshaw, who James Lindsay criticizes all the time, even she herself said that the way that people like Robin DiAngelo use the term intersectionality is totally fucked up and incorrect based on what her definition is of it. So that's
Right.
an important distinction to make too. But yeah, talking with me, man, always fun to talk with you. And as I said, check out Dusty's channel, Woke Centrist, for that white fragility discussion and plenty of others. And then tomorrow, of course, we're going to talk about the last half of season 3 of Castlevania on your channel, which will be really fun too. And yeah, also check out on Sunday here on my channel again. Dusty is going to join me along with our regular movie chat partners, Chris James, aka Tubin, and Scazio, aka Shizan Elmger, and we're going to talk about Blade, the 1997 awesome vampire movie, which is nothing like Twilight because the vampires are actually evil, bad monsters, which is what they're supposed to be. So that'll be fun to talk about. And yeah, thanks for please subscribe to the channel, like the video, click the bell to be notified when I come out with new videos, and especially thanks to those of you who give me money on Patreon, which I greatly appreciate, and I've got the proper link in the description there. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And investigate the boogeyman or so-called dangerous ideas. They're usually not as scary as you expect them to be. And yeah, anything else to say before we end it there, Dusty?
Yeah, I don't want to really interrupt your flow because it looks like you plugged me yourself. But there's one thing I want you to try and do before we end the stream. I need to get you to sing a vocal version of the Bloodbath song in the beginning of Blade there.
The Bloodbath song?
Do your best rendition of that.
I don't remember what the Bloodbath song is.
The song in the very beginning where they're in like the club and there's like blood sprinkling from the ceiling.
What do you mean, like the music that's playing?
Yes.
Oh, I don't remember how it goes.
You don't remember the Bloodbath song?
No.
Confusion.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a story about that song when we talk about Blade, because there's a really interesting anecdote about that particular song and how it relates to the movie itself.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, that'll be fun to talk about.
Yeah. All right, man. But yeah, thanks for having me. Check us out tomorrow when we talk about Castlevania, and on Sunday when we talk about Blade. Looking forward to both of those chats, and I'll see you later, and thank you for watching.
All right. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and adios until next time.